welcome to The Context. I'm John Barron. Next month, NASA plans to send a massive new rocket and capsule into space as the next step in returning man to the moon in 2025, although this time, first onto the moon will be a woman. It's 50 years since we last left the lunar surface, so why are we going back, and haven't we got better things to do with the money? But first, as Australia is being hit by yet another COVID wave, we thought it was a good time to put the coronavirus into context. Here's Madeleine Morris.
At the end of 2020, hopes were high the COVID-19 pandemic would soon be over. Vaccines were on the way, lockdowns had been lifted. By then, there'd been over 28,000 COVID cases in Australia and 909 people had died of the disease. A year later, we'd had over 395,000 cases, 2,234 people had died, many of us had been locked down again, most adults had been double vaxxed and were getting boosters. By the end of that year, the new Omicron variant active cases had soared to close to 138,000. Now, almost 7 months later, where are we? Well, official data shows around 95% of Australians over the age of 16 have received 2 vaccine doses. But the booster program hasn't been nearly as successful. 71% have received at least 1 booster. But break that down further, of the people eligible to get a 4th dose, and that's now everyone over 30, fewer than 1 in 3 have rolled up their sleeves. Although some are waiting the recommended 3 months after an infection before getting boosted. As of this week, with double and triple vaccine immunity waning and a new wave of infections being fueled by the BA5 subvariant of Omicron, there are well over 5,000 Australians currently in hospital with COVID. That is a record. So far in the pandemic, there have been over 9 million confirmed COVID cases in Australia. The death toll has passed 11,000 and we are approaching 400,000 active cases. Bear in mind, all of this is from a population of nearly 26 million. So let's try and put that into some context. Understanding that data collection differs from country to country and case numbers rely on testing, which has become less freely available. Even the number of COVID deaths is subject to different measures and ultimately comes down to what an individual doctor puts on a death certificate when there are other underlying conditions involved. The United Kingdom has had over 23 million COVID cases. That is over 2.5 times the number we've had from a population that is larger by a similar proportion. But so far, England has experienced 16 times the number of COVID deaths as Australia. That's because of their 2020 experience and 2021. It was very different to ours. A year into the pandemic, when vaccines started to slow the death rate in March 2021, 125,000 Brits had already been lost to the disease. Through a combination of factors including policy, geography, climate and lower population density, Australia escaped the worst of it during the unvaccinated phase of the pandemic. Yet COVID is still one of the deadliest diseases in this country as well. Again, a note on the numbers, some people die with COVID but of something else like cancer. But according to official figures, 88% of people who died with COVID died in fact from COVID. So if we project the current number of deaths from COVID to the end of the year, it's on track to rival dementia as the second leading cause of death in Australia, behind only heart disease. Those record high numbers in hospital with COVID reflect both the seriousness of the disease and its prevalence in the community. But there is some better news too. Vaccines and boosters have reduced the number of people being admitted to intensive care. There were 420 during the last wave in January. Now, with even more in hospital, there are significantly fewer.
For more, we're joined by one of America's leading experts in infectious diseases, Dr Peter Hotez. Doctor, 2.5 years into this pandemic, we all hope that we're nearer to the end than the beginning, but is there any way to know?
Well, it looks like, this BA5 subvariant in some ways is as bad as any of the others in terms of ability to infect people. Certainly, the transmission levels are an all-time high with this BA.5 subvariant. And here in the United States, people are still piling into hospitals. And although the deaths are not as high for reasons that we can talk about, so instead of being the leading cause of death in the United States, it's now maybe the fourth or fifth leading cause of death in the United States, but still a lot of people are losing their lives from COVID. So I think we have to be really careful about saying we're in the last gasps of this pandemic. It's looking like 2022 is almost as bad a year as 2020 or 2021, unfortunately.
So can you put BA.5 into context for us? If we're fully vaccinated and boosted, is it yet on a par with the flu, or is it still worse than that?
I don't necessarily like the flu comparisons, but if you're vaccinated and boosted, and if you're more than 4 months after your first boost, if you've gotten a second boost, what we've seen is that the deaths are pretty, there's very few deaths in that group. Some hospitalizations, but clearly that second boost is protecting you against severe disease, generally speaking. But unfortunately, that's a minority of individuals. I don't know what the situation is like in Australia, but here in the United States, only about 30% of Americans have even agreed to take their second booster. And now for the second booster, only about 25% of Americans over the age of 65. So it's a small minority of people that are actually accepting the boosters. And, you know, there's still this misunderstanding that 2 doses of the vaccine somehow constitutes full immunization. Maybe it was really never true, but it's especially not true with these Omicron subvariants.
Are there historical pandemics of other infectious disease outbreaks to give us a useful roadmap from here, or is COVID-19 uniquely unpredictable?
COVID-19 is now the third major coronavirus that we've had in the 21st century. If you remember, we started out the 21st century with SARS that rose out of southern China in 2002 and hit Canada. Then we had Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, another coronavirus out of the Arabian Peninsula. It also hit Korea hard, and now this one. And so even when we are on the backside of COVID-19, which we're not yet, but assuming that we get there, let's say over the next year or so, you know, we're still at risk for COVID-27 and COVID-32 because we haven't really understood all of the forces that are driving the emergence of these coronavirus pathogens. So we've got to get better at understanding the drivers of what causes coronaviruses to emerge out of bats and jump eventually to people. And also at some point develop a universal coronavirus vaccine. So, you know, it's hard to make direct comparisons. I know a lot of people are always tempted to draw parallels to the Middle East, to the plagues of the Middle Ages and pandemic flu from 1918 and Ebola, but each pathogen has its own unique characteristics, and I think we're best thinking of them along those lines for their individual dangers and characteristics.
We hear about herd immunity for diseases like measles and mumps being above 90-95%. Is there a magic number that you think gets us to herd immunity from COVID?
Well, the reasons we can have that discussion about herd immunity in measles, which, as you rightly point out, is well over 90%, is because the virus is fairly stable in its genome. It doesn't undergo a lot of variation. Unfortunately, we were kind of hoping that was going to be true with COVID-19 when we saw the original lineage, then the Alpha, and then Delta. Yes, there were changes, but they were modest in scope, and as a consequence, you know, the immunity built up against the original lineage was directly applicable to Alpha and Delta. Not so much with Omicron and these subvariants. They're switching up so much that, for instance, even if you've been infected with Omicron in the past, and a lot of people globally were back in December of last year and into January of this year, that's, unless you've been vaccinated on top of it, that is not providing you much protection against BA.5 reinfection. So that really throws out all the ideas of herd immunity. And of course, herd immunity was a concept that was weaponized by a lot of people trying to downplay the pandemic, and they were coming up with crazy numbers like 20% or 40%. It was never true, and unfortunately, it's not true now. So I think we have to partly discard the concepts of herd immunity.
Dr Peter Hotez, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, all the best.
Just about everybody knows the name of the first man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong. Less well remembered, though, is the last. He was the commander of Apollo 17, Eugene Cernan. Well, this year marks half a century since humans last ventured onto the lunar surface. But the race is on to return and to go much further, despite the cost and the risks. 4 months into his presidency in May 1961, John F. Kennedy went to Congress to ask them for the money to meet a very ambitious goal.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Kennedy's bold vision came with a hefty price tag. By the mid-1960s, NASA was consuming almost 4.5% of all US spending.
That's one small step for man.
When Armstrong and Aldrin took those small steps 8 years later, Kennedy was already dead, and the man he'd defeated for the White House, Richard Nixon, was now in the Oval Office and happy to bathe in the glory of the moment.
Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House.
For Nixon and America, the moon landing was a welcome distraction from the conflict in Vietnam and the anti-war and civil rights protests roiling America's cities. But JFK had left an important question unasked and unanswered. Assuming they made it to the moon, then what?
For those who haven't read the plaque,
Some in Washington and NASA argued that Apollo 11 should be it, one and done. Plant the flag and come on home, having triumphed in the space race and proven America's superiority over the Soviets in the Cold War.
He's got it made. Come on in there. 24 feet. Contact light. Roger, copy contact.
Despite some animated trickery, Apollo 12, later in 1969, was, like a lot of sequels, just a little underwhelming. It did not capture the public's imagination in quite the same way.
I think I landed at head crater.
NASA's budget was cut, below 2% of federal spending. In March 1970, the Apollo program was trimmed from 20 to 19 missions. Plans for semi-permanent laboratories on the moon were replaced with the cheaper orbiting Skylab.
Ignition, Fred.
Roger. Roger. Right again.
Go, guys.
We've had a hardware restart. I don't know what it was.
Okay. Houston, we've had a problem.
This is indeed the gravest emergency, probably yet, in the American space program.
The flight of Apollo 13 in April 1970 nearly ended in disaster when a short circuit triggered an explosion in the oxygen tank. The lunar landing was aborted, and for 3 days the world held its breath as the astronauts risked running out of air.
Odyssey, Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Disaster averted, but NASA administrators were worried. So was Nixon. They trimmed another 2 missions from the Apollo program. Congress slashed almost $500 million from their budget. A year later, Apollo 15 involved a 3-day stay on the moon and made for great TV with the first moon buggy rides. The American public tuned back in.
And Jim, you might want to start the camera.
Yeah, it's running, Joe.
At that point, President Nixon again considered declaring mission accomplished and cancelling the final 2 Apollo flights. He didn't want to damage his 1972 re-election chances with a possible disaster. In the end, Nixon was talked out of that, instead announcing NASA's next giant leap. The successor to Apollo would be a space shuttle, which wouldn't even fly until he was safely out of office. And so, after Nixon had won his second term, on December 14th, 1972, 2 years and 5 months after Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon, Apollo 17 commander Gene Cernan became the last.
3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector grid.
The building is a luxurious apartment.
A troubled decade followed for NASA and the United States. Nixon was forced to resign over Watergate. There was an oil crisis, stagflation, a communist takeover in South Vietnam, and Skylab crashed back to Earth in outback Western Australia.
Ignition and liftoff.
Meanwhile, the Space Shuttle program was plagued with technical problems, delays and cost blowouts that wouldn't see it fly into space until the 1980s. And even as it inspired a new generation about the possibility of manned flight, it was also marked by disaster.
It was McAuliffe who attracted most attention, who received an apple for the teacher as she and her 6 crewmates prepared to board the shuttle this morning.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
50 years after the last man on the moon, as billionaires try to make space a holiday destination and ideological and commercial battles play out in a new space race, in real terms, NASA's budget is less than 1/10 of the size it was. Some argue that sending humans back to the moon and even Mars will always pose an unacceptable risk to life.
Yes, sir.
Robots are so much simpler. They don't need air, water or food, and nobody really mourns their loss. Others maintain it is innate for humans to forge new frontiers. Without that human element, those of us still on Earth just won't care. History suggests, though, that either way, we are a fickle lot and may quickly lose interest and demand our tax dollars be spent instead on fixing a world of problems closer to home. With us now is Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith, astrophysicist, author and Australian Women in STEM Ambassador. Professor, welcome to The Context.
Thanks, John. Nice to be here.
We've been talking about the Artemis program as the successor to Apollo. How big a deal do you think it will be for the world to see a woman set foot on the moon?
Well, I think it's incredibly significant. I mean, just on an emotional level, we still have this visceral feeling, whether or not we were there in 1969, even alive. I wasn't, but I still get this emotional connection to that incredible event when Neil and Buzz, flew to the moon and one small step for a man and all that. I think, to revisit that in a more modern age, to send the first woman to the moon, to send the first person of colour to the moon, which is what NASA have said they will do, that is an incredibly important symbolic step, at least, to, put the stamp on the modern age of space travel and to really focus on opening up space to more people and exciting the next generation. I mean, that kind of becomes a bit of a trope, but, when you send 12 white men to the moon, there are often, those justified, worries that we're not representing humankind. And the great thing about space is that international cooperation. And I think with Artemis, let's hope that this is a new age of cooperation that we can contribute to.
50 years after Gene Cernan was the last of those men on the moon, do you think it is even worth going back? And if so, why did we ever stop going?
Well, it was an incredible feat at the time, but you look at the geopolitical situation. The US were under a lot of pressure. They'd entered the Vietnam War. They had conscription. They had racial injustice. They had a lot of social strife, and there was a lot of pressure from the American public to actually focus on some of those important issues. So I think the moon program, the Apollo program initially in the 60s and 70s, it was a great success. But as they went through more and more of the Apollo missions, fewer and fewer people were actually switching on. And with, the final Apollo mission in 1972, Gene Cernan, in fact, was telling me when we toured Australia that, you know, a lot of people switched off and they stopped broadcasting from the surface of the moon. I mean, people getting bored of that. In this TikTok age, you can probably imagine people doing the similar thing. So, you know, I think we need to think about why we're going. And, you know, in the interim years, we've had a very successful program of cooperation with the International Space Station. That's been continuously inhabited by people since the year 2000. So it's an incredible period of learning how to safely, consistently get to space, live in space. People have been living there for more than 20 years now. Non-stop. We're well versed in space travel, and now we want to expand our horizons once again.
I wonder, is there a good scientific or technical reason to send people into space these days, or is that more about symbolism and public relations?
That's an important question, and there's a few schools of thought on this. I think one of the great things about humans is practical, and that we're dexterous. We can think, we can make decisions on our feet, and artificial intelligence, AI, is not very good at that yet. So, okay, a chess game can be won by a computer, but for anything more complex and anything unexpected that happens, and that kind of stuff happens a lot in space, it's really hard for a computer or a robot to make sensible decisions. So, you know, in terms of rovers picking up rocks and zapping them with lasers and finding out what's inside, it's great. But real exploration, and the type of exploration we want to do on the moon to understand its history and the origin of the solar system, that kind of stuff people are really quite good at. And the other thing is, when we get to Mars, the light travel time is really significant. And what that means is light travels at the speed of light, as you know, as the name suggests, and that means signals and the light and the radio signals, so the communications from Mars, take 15 minutes each way to travel. So if you say, mission control, do you read me? The astronaut on Mars doesn't hear that for 15 minutes. And they say, copy that, and that signal takes 15 minutes to get back. So you can't have a conversation with mission control. You can't receive real-time instructions, and you can't send those to robots either on Mars. So communications are difficult. So human beings kind of create this element of sophistication and adaptability that robots can't yet reach. So I think that's a couple of the reasons why human beings are really quite good for limited amounts of space travel.
Thank you very much indeed for giving us some context, Professor.
It's a pleasure, John. Cheers.
While astrophysicists seem to get more excited about the possibility of finding traces of microbial life, for a lot of us, of course, the burning question is whether there are aliens out there. In the 1950s and 60s, there were plenty of reports, comic books, TV shows and movies about UFOs and flying saucers. And in recent years, the US government has released Defence Department video that has fuelled interest in the possibility of visitors from other planets. With Now and Then, here's Ange Lavoie-Pierre.
So do you think that there is life on other planets?
No. Well, you know what? Probably. Yeah. Like, if there's some here, what makes you think there's not anywhere else, right?
Do you think there is life on other planets?
No, I hope not.
Why do you hope not?
Because they'll be frozen to death. Trouble?
Take a look for yourself.
World.
That's nothing from this world.
Well, it's hard to imagine that there's all these other stars and planets and there's nothing.
It's a debatable point, I suppose.
What do you think yourself? You must have an opinion here.
Well, definitely not.
Do you think there's life on other planets?
Oh my God, why?
I wouldn't have a notion.
You haven't thought about this at all?
Oh, I've thought about it, but no, I wouldn't think there would be.
I think there is life on other planets.
There's got to be at least something. If it's not anything like that, like us, it's got to at least be like bacteria or something really small.
You seem definite. You seem
Definitely.
How do you see this life and where?
Oh, I've seen a flying saucer.
You've seen one?
Yes,
where
definitely. At Lane Cove.
When was this?
1953.
You don't think this is a figment of your imagination?
Several other people with me saw it.
Yeah, most likely. I think if you look far enough.
I reckon it'd be cool if they were a different colour and just popped up every now and then.
Take a good look at your beloved candidates. They're nothing but hideous space reptiles.
I reckon there is.
What makes you reckon that?
Well, just, I don't know, it's not imagination, it's just what,
You're being led by scientific discoveries, etc.
Yes?
Yes, definitely.
Why? What sort of life do you see up there?
A vegetable.
But do you think that it's possible?
Yeah, it is possible, but I think that our time zone in the environment is like so minute, so they could be 10 million years behind us or 10 million years in front of us.
What form do you think it takes?
Animal, because we're animals, aren't we?
Some of it.
Yes.
Speak for yourself.
I think there's some type of alien for life or whatever it may be that's like definitely surpassed us by like milestones. Whether they have like, they can control their entire planet or their galaxy or whatever it may be.
What did it look like?
It was standing up there, still.
Just suspended in space?
With colours coming out of it.
Flat or on its side?
It was around.
And you think this was sent from another planet, do you?
I really do. Well, where else would it come from?
Do you think it would be a good thing for the Earth if there was life indeed up there on Venus?
I suppose competition is pretty good at any time, isn't it?
Would you like to get up there yourself and see it on Venus?
Not particularly.
Why not?
So I like it down here.
And would you want to meet them?
Online?
Would you like to get up there and find out for yourself?
Definitely.
Would you?
Too right,
Would you
I would.
volunteer for this?
Too right, I would. I'd like to be the first woman in space.
Most people are like, no, it'd be super dangerous. I don't want to do it.
Can't be more dangerous than anyone here. I don't really want to meet half my family on a normal day, so no, maybe not. Have a nice life.
With millions of people around the world dying of infectious diseases and billions still unvaccinated, so much poverty and disadvantage to see, is there any way ethically to justify spending billions of dollars reaching for the stars? That's the question that I put to Dr Brian Green from the Centre for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University and author of the book Space Ethics.
That is one of the biggest questions in the ethics of space exploration. And I think that one of the things that we have to remember is that space has actually brought a huge number of benefits to the world right here down here on Earth. For example, GPS navigation, communication satellites, all sorts of satellites which are monitoring the weather, for example, so that we can prepare for storms and various other forms of disasters that we can perceive with weather satellites. There are just a lot of benefits that we get from space that we don't always think about, but that we really should keep in mind, because those are technologies we wouldn't have if we hadn't been working very hard to build them for such a long time.
OK, Tang and Velcro and GPS systems are all handy things to have, I suppose. But where do you draw the line? What proportion of the US federal budget would you say it is ethical to spend on space when a lot of people in America still can't afford healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult question. I don't know if we could easily put a number on it. What I would say is that I don't think we are there yet, because there's a lot more benefit to be had from space exploration in terms of not only scientific knowledge learned, not only technological development to be had, but also in terms of just making sure that there are people who are in a safe place in case a disaster befalls the Earth. Because, for example, we have nuclear war as a threat that's become much bigger than it used to be just a year ago. It's become something that people are talking about again. And it would be, if we had, for example, a self-sustaining colony on the moon or on another planet, then if we had a disaster here on Earth, there's a possibility, of course, that they could come and help us, or at least present a safe place for people to be living in the universe.
And that's all for the context for this week and for this season. You'll find our earlier episodes on ABC iView and online. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon. But before we go, a little bit of news.
Welcome to Backchat. I'm Tim Bowden. Our first letter this week comes from Mr. Chaz Licciardello of Point Piper in Sydney. He asks, now that the stupid context show is over, when is Planet America coming back? Well, Chaz, you'd better get back into the office because Planet America is back in September. Good night.